Colleagues, you've all just had a fabulous lunch, and that is a problem. It's not your problem, it's my problem, because we are now in the world of the post-lunch lull. And my job today is a simple one. My job is to get you re-energized and excited and taking part in our event today so that the illustrious speakers who will follow me I will have your rapt attention. So really it's time now for a bit of disruptive communications. And I'm going to be very disruptive today. Thank you. I'm going to be very disruptive today because you are going to hear from a lot of very good speakers over the course of today and tomorrow. You're going to see a lot of data. You're going to see a lot of case studies. You're going to see none of that from me. I'm going to do something very different. I'm going to talk to you about an idea, a theory, a metaphor. Effectively, this is what happens when you ask somebody with an arts background to talk about science. And we are going to be talking about science today. More particularly, we are going to be talking about nothing. Nothing at all. And how do we measure nothing? Or how can we use quantum theory to help us evaluate the absence of an action? What on earth am I talking about? Well, in government, and we had an excellent speaker from Singapore earlier, and I'm sure my Singaporean colleague will agree, one of the challenges that we have always been wrestling with is that compared to the private sector, measurement is more significantly difficult because we are often trying to measure nothing. We are often trying to measure the absence of something, the absence of an action. If you're in a private sector world, you usually have product. You're usually trying to sell that product. And ultimately, there is going to be one KPI that really matters, and that will be sales data. Lots of things you want to sit behind that, but ultimately you have that. We don't. We have no product. And sometimes the action that we want is, as I say, inaction. So as government, one of the things that we focus on a lot is smoking and trying to get people to give up smoking, as this very successful British advert illustrates. But there is a natural limit to the amount of success you can achieve in getting people to give up smoking, because there will be always a hardcore who will simply not respond. The real challenge these days is a different one. It is getting people not to start smoking. Now, that inevitably means teenagers. And all teenagers start as children, and all children start as non-smokers. So we want them to remain non-smokers. Now, if they end up like these teenagers, measurement is easy. We failed. But what about these teenagers? They're not smoking. They're healthy, happy. They weren't smoking 2 years ago. They're not smoking now. Did we achieve anything? Hard to know. Very hard to know. Can we take credit for their lack of smoking? Was it our work that caused that to come about? Here we get into some of the difficulties that government traditionally faces. In the UK, we have built a new evaluation framework, which is this, which is designed to help us deal with some of these questions. And this categorizes different points of evaluation into 5 different areas: inputs, outputs, outtakes, outcomes, and final impact. Now, I don't propose to go through all of that in detail now. The point is to say that we understand the different category of thing that we are measuring. And the relationship between them is so important. And this will be the theme of my talk today. And having a framework like this is so important for us because the behavioral journeys that we want to take our audience on to get inaction or action is very complicated. So this is the behavioral map for teens and smoking. And we are looking here at, interestingly, appetite for risk. Because it's not attitudes to smoking that is the defining factor in whether a teen is likely to start smoking. And therefore, that is not the thing we should be measuring. What is actually the defining factor is their approach and understanding of risk and all the things that make up their propensity to engage in risk. So the campaign that we run, which affects teens, very rarely talks about smoking. It's this campaign. It's called Rise Above. And it is about self-confidence. Because what we find is that that works as a far greater proxy for the likelihood of teens taking up smoking than a simple attitudinal approach. So things like body confidence amongst teenagers can lead us to understand whether smoking is likely to happen. Now, what does all this have to do with quantum theory? Well, think back to that teen audience again. They're not smoking. We don't want them to smoke. They are in a 2-year period, let's say. And at that point, they are both potential smokers and potential non-smokers at the same time. And it's that potentiality that we are interested in. It's that potentiality that we need to try to measure. But traditional measurement is very bad at this. So one of the things I've become interested in is thinking, well, where are there people who are measuring potentiality? And those people are particle physicists. Before I proceed, are there any particle physicists in the room? No. Well, that's a good start. If there are any even just physicists or just scientists in the room, then I do apologize for being about to butcher the science. But it is a metaphor today, so we're not that interested in some of the specifics. We are interested in the application. But we do need to go through some of the science in order that the metaphor makes sense. So, welcome to the world of the massless particle. Now, the massless particle is the fundamental idea of two things being in the same place in a different place. So one thing being in multiple places at the same time. I did say I was going to butcher the science. And this sounds really weird because all of our logic says to us things cannot be in multiple places at the same time. All observational sense tells us that's wrong. And yet, evidence, research, tells us that it is, in fact, true. And so we have to abandon Newtonian physics, and we have to get into this world instead. So it's impossible to measure something without mass using normal approaches. Just cannot be done. So how do you measure it? Well, first of all, you have to understand what is going on. So the nucleus is not in the center of the particle, where it would normally be. It occurs erratically in the particle, and the behavior of the particle, therefore, cannot be accurately predicted. That's the first and most important thing. And because that particle, that photon, is always moving, you get a wave. And the wave, don't think of it like a wave as you would understand it. Don't think of it like a wave of water. The wave is a way of expressing the potentiality of the particle. It's a way of expressing the idea that the particle is taking an infinite number of journeys simultaneously and can be in multiple places at the same time. And we can only therefore measure that wave by the effect that it has on its surroundings. It's the only way it can be detected. You cannot see it itself. Because you can only measure the position of the electron, or you can measure the momentum of the wave. You can't measure both. There's a limitation to measurement. And the quantum object doesn't exist, or can't be said to exist, in ordinary space-time until we observe it. Only observation causes it to exist, because observation collapses the wave. Observation brings it from having infinite potential into the here and now. And all that infinity is then brought into one particular moment, one specific thing, and that wave, that expression of potentiality, collapses and no longer exists. And crucially, and this is where it really starts to mess with your head, the way in which we observe the wave decides what we see. So our belief system, our assumptions about what we're going to see, create the world around us. Now, that's the science bit largely over. How do we apply this? So, principles for our world. Thinking about what we've just said, you can track some of these over. And the first thing is to say, you can measure what someone does or is doing. This is not the same, however, as measuring what they will do. And what they will do needs to be measured in a different way. Just like collapsing the wave, when we observe an audience, when we make a measurement, we are collapsing the potential of other things. So we are observing that particular moment in space-time, and we are observing the behavior and the attitude and the opinion of someone in that specific moment, subject to the specific conditions that they are subject to. And of course, we all know this, but it's interesting to think about it in the context of the quantum world. Direct observation fundamentally alters the behavior of the audience or the subject being measured. Just like collapsing that wave, just like looking for that particle, the moment we look, we change. And therefore, the biases in our methodologies and in ourselves affect the results and produce variable conclusions. So, with all of that set out, what does that mean for applying it in practice? Well, I'm going to be a little disruptive, a little controversial here, and I'm going to say that when you're looking to measure the absence of something, key performance indicators are your enemy. Because what they do is they give you a snapshot. That snapshot is not helpful because it gives you that moment in time, that breakdown, rather than understanding the potential of your audience. And for that reason, there's no value in page views, click-throughs, things like that. We measure them all the time, but in of themselves, they hold no importance. We have to have multiple methodologies if we're going to avoid the system bias. And we need to be measuring in a dynamic way. And crucially, and bringing me to the main thrust of my argument. Final outcome measures, the things that we think are important, cannot be trusted if they do not correlate to the whole journey. In of themselves, you have to assume that your bias, the bias of your methodology, the act of observing has compromised your results. And therefore, you have to think, how am I tracking this back through the audience's other behaviors in order to build up that bigger picture? In other words, just like identifying the presence of the particle by its effect on the world around it, we can only realistically measure inaction in our audience by looking at how all of the contextual factors that surround them are being adjusted by their behavior. So, just like I was saying at the start, I don't want to ask my teen smoking audience, what do you think about smoking? That doesn't tell me anything useful. I do want to ask them, how many friends do you have? Are you happy at school? Are you confident in your sexuality? These kind of questions show us the behaviors and the attitudes and the activities that our audience is engaged in, which create a pattern, which makes them more likely to become teenage smokers. Therefore, we can target our communications at them better. And therefore, if those people particularly have not taken up smoking and they were exposed to our work, we can make reasonable inference that we can take some credit for their lack of action. One last very disruptive thought for you, which is this: metrics don't matter. And I say that being very disruptive because I know that AMEC likes to say, as a strapline, metrics matter. I'm talking specifically in the context of inaction and what I've been discussing today. And what do I mean by metrics don't matter? What I mean is ratios do. The relationship between different categories of measure. That's what reveals the truth in what your audience is doing. And they explain how they really interact with you. And you can then build that contextual map. And that brings us back completely to the UK model for evaluation, UK framework. And those ratios are ratios between these different 5 categories. How many people go from receiving your output to understanding what you've said, to acting on what you've said, to sustaining that behavior? The absolute numbers are unimportant. The numbers between the metrics are what is important when you are trying to measure that most difficult of things, inaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, David. That's a presentation with a difference, that's for sure. Thank you. So I'm looking for the first question from the audience in this first post-lunch session.
And I should say, if people don't want to ask about particle physics and want to ask me about Brexit, that's fine too.
There's a question over on the left.
Hello. Is that work? Yeah, hi. Hi, Jason Weeks from Prime Research. David, being in government comms, I imagine you're fairly used to managing crises. And quite often in crises, what we're asked as measurement professionals is to measure the absence of things, the suppression of a story, something like that. I wondered if you've got any experience of how you'd go about measuring, suppression and things like that.
Yeah, so, and that's obviously the same basic topic as what I presented, but you wouldn't approach it in quite this way, because this is much more about campaigning. Look, I mean, I think one of the difficulties for government here is this issue of, did we achieve it or not? In a crisis, however, government doesn't really care whether it was its work. What they care about was the story suppressed? So we will largely not try, frankly, and measure that. We will simply look at the techniques that we have used historically that have correlated with stories being suppressed. I mean, suppressed is a pejorative term, but not getting legs, let's say. And one of the other things that government can do, frankly, and we're in a very unique and lucky position here, is again be disruptive. So we have other news. So we can think, right, well, how do we move that news agenda on? And that's not in an appropriate or undemocratic way. It's about saying, okay, this story has now had a day, 2 days of news time. We can either let that story run, or we can do something else. And so sometimes we would think, right, let's bring forward something else that we might have had on schedule, but which is particularly interesting either to the news media that we know are running with this, or to the publics that are particularly interested in it.
Thank you. Question at the back, please.
Hello, I'm Lasse from Infomedia. I love the theory, but could you give us any examples from how you use it in practice?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I hope that the smoking theory has the smoking example did bring that to life to a certain amount. But if you look at something like house fires, which is another campaign we have, trying to get people to be much more aware of and act on house fires. Again, it's very hard to measure the individual behavior, because the individual behavior we want is people to test their smoke alarms. They do that in their home, and they don't report that back. And the act of, as I've been saying, the act of asking them creates massive deviations from the truth. If you ask somebody to do if you ask somebody whether they are doing something that they probably should be doing, something that's socially responsible or in their interests, they very rarely want to say, no, I'm not doing that, because that makes them look foolish or ignorant. So we have to absolutely discount all of that kind of data, primarily, and look instead at the other kinds of things that they are doing. So a very good proxy here is older, single, northern English men who drink and smoke at home tend to be more at risk in domestic house fires. So we can look at those behaviors of how much are they drinking at home, are they buying cans of beer rather than going to the pub, all of these kind of things, and looking at the potentiality, the probability of them being an at-risk group. And then we can look, where are those people located physically? And then we can look at sales of smoke alarms and batteries, interestingly, because there's batteries that run out, in the stores directly near them. And we can look to see, are we getting any correlative spikes between our communications and things like that. So that takes us into a whole other realm where instead of asking people, what are you doing, what do you think, we are looking at the data that surrounds them and making inferences from it.
Thank you. One last question at the back.
Neil Parker from Press Reader. It seems that what you're saying is that indirect observation doesn't have the same effect as direct observation. Is that correct? Because that doesn't seem intuitive. If you're observing something indirectly by using a tool, for example, how does that differ from qualitatively from observing it directly?
Neil, that is almost what I'm saying. It's a very good way of putting it. So it's about indirectly observing not the thing itself, but things near it, things indicative of what it is you're trying to look for. So not looking, this is the crucial thing that the particle physicists do when they're hunting the Higgs boson or whatever. They don't look for it, they look around it. So it's looking at the things that are affected by the alternative things that are affected by the behavior you are trying to evaluate. If you can understand what they are and measure them, then you do so in a way that does not artificially affect the behavior itself, and therefore you are more likely to get accurate results.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, David.
Pleasure. Thank you.